Hello and welcome to Catholic Answers Live on this Feast of the Assumption. I am your host, Cy Kellett, and if you're not familiar with the Feast of the Assumption, it's celebrated August 15th each year by almost all of us, by the vast majority of Christians, I should say. I believe it's a date that we share in common with all the Orthodox churches as well, and many Protestant churches as well. And it's the day of the celebration of Mary ascending into heaven, or I shouldn't say ascending into heaven, being assumed into heaven, which is kind of a little glimpse of what's up for us about the resurrection of the body and the body continuing, not being discarded so that we'll be ghosts forever, but the resurrection of the body as an important part of our faith. So I hope this is a very blessed feast day for you and a happy day, and we're just delighted to have you for a summer afternoon. And Jimmy Akin is our guest for 2 hours of Internet Open Forum. Jimmy Akin, senior apologist here at Catholic Answers, the author of The Bible is a Catholic Book, among many other things, and the proprietor of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Hello, Jimmy Akin.
Hello, Cy Kellett. You said Protestant churches, some of them celebrate the Assumption of Mary. Which Protestant churches are you thinking of?
I was thinking of Anglicans, that there are Anglicans who celebrate it, but I may have been mistaken on that. But I thought that there were...
There might be some Anglo-Catholics who do, but I'm not aware of other Protestants who do.
As I was saying that, I was thinking, I wonder if I'm even right about that. But we do this is a very ancient feast. So it's one that we share with even churches that have been divided from us over the centuries. Yeah. I'm not going to give out the number because it's an Internet Open Forum. The Internet has about 1 million questions for Jimmy Akin, and one of them each week is, what's dropping on Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World this week?
Well, last Friday, the 11th, was the 5th anniversary of the show. So I invited the listeners to send in their mysterious experiences that they've had, and then I offer a few comments on the experiences they reported. This Friday, we're going in a different direction, and we're talking about a gentleman from the 19th century named Leo Taxil. He was a French freethinker. You know, he was raised Catholic, but he lost his faith and became a freethinker and became a Mason.
Okay.
And then he reverted to the Catholic Church, and he started writing books that were exposés of Freemasonry. And other people came forward and confirmed what he was saying, and it was pretty disturbing. So we're going to be talking about Leo Taxil's Masonic revelations.
And this was a 19th century thing, you said?
Yes, he even met with Pope Leo XIII, and he had a lot of support from cardinals at the Vatican and other Vatican officials, and so he made a rather big splash.
Oh, at least alleging that he was revealing the secrets. So we'll find out, were they really the secrets?
Well, he did reveal a lot of secrets. A lot of them had already been revealed before in other literature, but he called particular attention to them and then made some additional revelations.
Oh, all right. I'm looking forward to this one. So does this must be momentous in the history of relations between Catholics and Masons, because I know that Catholics were forbidden from being Masons for a long time.
They still are, but we go into this in considerable detail, and it's an extremely interesting story.
Oh, all right. Coming up this Friday on Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. On this Feast of the Assumption, we got a bunch of great questions from the Internet, and some of them long, so I'll be reading them, but and some short, but all great. One of the nice things about getting to do these Internet Open Forums is we get to kind of, select the questions and organize them, and then it assures that we get a great variety of questions. So here's our first one. This one comes from Sue.
Sue, I think.
Sue, okay. How can Catholics respond to the argument against human life beginning at conception, which goes like this? If human life begins at conception, that implies the zygote is already a person. But identical twins come from the same zygote. So the zygote cell cannot already be a one-of-a-kind person. A zygote can even fuse with another zygote to create a single new embryo. And we do know that the cells of the normal early embryo are totipotent, meaning each cell or group of cells from a single normal early embryo can become an embryo too, and subsequently a person too, evidenced by triplets and quadruplets. Because of totipotency, Scientists and fertility clinics are able to routinely split apart embryos to create more embryos. But if life begins at conception, then are you saying every time an embryo is split into two embryos, a person is being split into two persons? Certainly not. Therefore, there is no inherent individuality with the zygote or early embryo, or earlier, thus cannot already be a one-of-a-kind person. Of course, a live zygote is living, but not a one-of-a-kind person, according to science.
Okay, so we can process this question on more than one level. The level we were just offered there at the end is the scientific level. And speaking scientifically, it is extremely clear that zygotes are alive. A zygote, for people who may not be familiar with, is a one-celled organism. So it's the earliest stage of development for higher life forms. We all start as one-celled zygotes, and then our cells diversify and grow. But it's extremely clear that zygotes are alive because they have metabolic processes that are happening in them. Dead zygotes don't grow. They don't divide. Their cells don't split. And so it's really clear that they are alive. The question is, from a scientific perspective, is not, are they a person? Because a person is a philosophical category. From a scientific perspective, the question is, are they living human beings? And yes, they're living because they have metabolic processes that are happening. Their cells are active, they process energy, they grow, they split, and so they're clearly alive. Are they human? Well, yes, they're human because they have a human genetic code, not the genetic code of a rabbit or a carrot or anything like that. Are they beings? Well, yes, they are, because a being, speaking from a scientific perspective, is simply an organism. It's something that is not part of another organism. It's its own distinct organism. And unborn children, even at the zygote stage, are distinct. They're not part of their mother. They may be inside their mother, but they're not part of their mother, as indicated by the fact they have their own genetic code, not their mother's genetic code. And if you leave them alone, they will just continue to grow and develop. So it's real clear they're organisms. Scientifically speaking, therefore, zygotes are living human organisms. Now, what the question goes on to ask is, well, what about cases where a zygote splits and you have twinning or even potentially more than that happening, where you end up with triplets or quadruplets that are all identical? Well, okay, there are other organisms that split. There are a lot of them, in fact, in the microbial world, lots of one-celled organisms, and even some multicellular organisms reproduce by fission, by splitting or twinning. And so this is an extremely common phenomenon among very small organisms. It's well known in science. They often fission. And cell division results not in a growth of the organism, but in two new organisms. And so what we can infer from this scientifically is that there is a stage at human life where that kind of fission is possible. And so you can have very small humans, either one cell or just a few cells, divide in such a way that you end up with two or more living human organisms. And that's simply what the science says. So yeah, they can split into new organisms. They do sometimes split into new organisms. It's not common in humans, but it can happen, and it does happen just like it happens in other organisms. But you wouldn't look at other organisms that use cell division as a form of reproduction and say that, oh, well, none of these are alive. That would make no sense. Neither would you look at them and say, oh, this organism and this other organism aren't really two separate organisms because they split at some point. No, they are two separate organisms now. And so scientifically speaking, there's no issue here. If you have an accurate understanding of the science, human zygotes are clearly living human organisms and art and natural twinning or cell division or fission is possible at very early stages of human development. Now, there are other questions that can be raised that operate on a religious or philosophical plane, like what happens in regard to the souls that these living human organisms would have. Now, strict materialists don't tend to believe in souls, but at least not today. But the soul is a religious and philosophical concept, not a scientific one. So we have to step aside from a purely scientific analysis if we want to ask about what happens with the souls of these individuals. However, even here, the Catholic Church has a very clear answer on what would happen. The Church teaches, and this is actually one of its infallible teachings, that the soul is the intellectual soul is the substantial form of the human body. And consequently, if you have a human body, it has a distinct intellectual soul that is integrating it and keeping it alive and so forth. So, on this one body, one soul principle, if you have a zygote come into existence, it's got a soul. What then would happen if it fissions? Well, okay, there seem to be two possibilities. One possibility is that the organism splits in such a way that neither resulting organism can claim to be the original. You have two brand new organisms at that point. The other alternative is that one of the two resulting organisms does have a claim to be the original. This would happen, for example, let's say you've got a 16 cell organism and two cells split off and form a new organism. Well, the original 14 cells then continue to grow and develop, and it would seem like you've got an argument that the 14 cells have an organic continuity with the original 16 cell creature, because we can add and lose cells. We do that all the time anyway.
Right.
We always have, our bodies are always making new cells and always having cells die in a process called apoptosis. And so you could look at the 14 and say, okay, this is essentially the same thing as the 16. It's just lost a couple of cells, but it's the same organism. So on the one body, one soul principle, what would happen in those two scenarios? Well, on the first scenario, where neither resulting organism has continuity of identity with the original organism, then the original organism died. You had a very short-lived human, and when it fissioned in such a way that you have two new organisms, the original organism would have just died. And you had two new organisms created. They also have human bodies, and therefore they've got two new souls. On the other hand, what happens on the second scenario, where you've got an organism that splits off maybe a little part of itself, but it continues on? Well, in that case, it has the same soul it originally did. You know, just like you and I have souls that continue in our bodies despite the fact we're constantly gaining and losing cells. The new organism that's newly created would then have a new soul. And so that's what would happen in that case. I forget if CU asks about chimeras, but which is where two organisms merge.
He did mention that, yeah.
Yeah, and
Right.
this also happens. It's another possibility in early human development. You can have two early humans merge, and the question is, what happens in those cases? Well, scientifically, they're a new living human organism, and religiously, philosophically, the same scenarios would play out if the two organisms fused in such a way that neither of them has continuity of identity with the original two organisms. Then the original two organisms died, and you have a new organism that has a new soul. On the other hand, if they merge in such a way that one of them has continuous identity, this is kind of like if you or I had an organ transplant. You know, you could get a new liver and you'd still be Cy Kellett.
Right.
In that case, the soul of the of the organism that has continuity would be the same, and the other organism that got merged into it and lost its continuity of identity, that one would have died and its soul would have gone off. So even on the philosophical and religious perspective, there are very feasible answers to this question, but strictly on a scientific perspective, zygotes and other early humans are living human organisms, and consequently, it's also possible for things like twinning and chimerism to occur in early human development the same way they occur in other species.
CU, I am so grateful for that question. It was a long question, but that was really worth it. I'm so glad we got to have that discussion. Thank you for sending us that question. If you ever want to send us a question for Internet Open Forums, you can always just email them to us at radio@catholic.com. Maybe you're in contact with Jimmy and you can get it to him. That will work as well. But we'll get it to Jimmy if you send it to radio@catholic.com. That does bring us to the break. We'll take a quick break. Be right back with more Internet Open Forum with Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live.
We're here for you. Call now. Catholic Answers Live.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects home buyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
Unplanned, the true story of Abby Johnson.
I would be the youngest director in Planned Parenthood history.
She believed in a woman's right to choose.
I've had an abortion myself, so I don't have any problem with another woman making the same decision.
Until the day she saw something that changed everything.
Tiny, perfect little baby. And then it was just gone.
Now she's pulling back the curtain on the abortion industry. Unplanned.
Available at EWTNRC.com and the EWTN app.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin is our guest. It's Internet Open Forum, both hours today, and we've got lots of great questions from the internet. So on we go. This one comes from Rose. Rose asks, if the ancient Egyptians had a 10-day week and the Israelites were slaves there for 400 years, where did they get the 7-day week from in the creation story? Does this affect the dating of the Pentateuch?
So we should probably start by talking about the concept of the week. Now, human timekeeping is governed by certain fundamentals that are astronomical in nature. The Earth rotates once every 24 hours, so the day is a basic timekeeping unit in all human cultures. And the Earth orbits the sun every little more than 365 days.
Right.
So the year is another universal timekeeping unit among humans. And the moon goes through its phases every about 29 days or so. And so the month, which comes from the word moon, is also a universal timekeeping unit in human cultures. But a year, and one of the reasons for the month is because a year is kind of long. You know, it's hundreds of days long.
Right.
And so you want to, if you want to say when something happened or when something's going to happen, you want to break that down a little bit. And that's why people use the phases of the moon originally in lunar calendars for months. But a month is it's like 29, 30 days long. And so, 30 days if you round it off. And so that's kind of a long period of time too. And different cultures have said, we'd like something intermediate between a month and a day. So we can keep track of time a little more precisely. And that intermediate unit is the week. And different cultures have divided up the months into different numbers of days for the week. Some cultures do it cleanly. This was the case, for example, with the Egyptians. They'd say, okay, every month is 30 days, and we're going to divide that by 3. So we have 3 10-day weeks every month. They also had 5 days left over at the end of the year, but they didn't count those. They just said, let's have a 5-day holiday.
Nice.
Other cultures have used other amounts. There have been 8-day weeks, 7-day weeks, 6-day weeks, 5-day weeks. I've even seen reports of 2-day weeks. My memory is that the Mesopotamians had either a 6 or 7-day week. And Mesopotamia and Egypt were the two cultures that had the most influence on Israel. Abraham, you'll recall, originally was a Mesopotamian. He came from Ur of the Chaldees, which is in Mesopotamia. And so if they had a 6 or 7-day week, that might have been the origin of the Hebrew week. And they may have just maintained that while they were slaves in Egypt for a lengthy period. They may not have assimilated on that point. On the other hand, they may have assimilated in Egypt to the Egyptian usage of a 10-day week. And then they could have revived the idea of a 7-day week, or it could have been a new revelation or a new invention after the Exodus. Unfortunately, we don't have a really good origin. We don't really have the knowledge of exactly how the Hebrew week developed. There have been speculations about it. For example, the number 7 is clearly important in Israelite culture. And one of the speculations is that it's linked to the number of planets, because historically, any light in the sky that moved, that didn't just circle like the fixed stars, any light in the sky that moved around against the background of the fixed stars was regarded as a wanderer, or in Greek, a planetes. And that's where we get the word planet. So originally, the planets were the sun, because it moves against the background of fixed stars, the moon, because it moves against the background of fixed stars, Mercury, Venus, Jupiter, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, because they all move against the background of the fixed stars. And so there were 7 classical planets, and some have speculated, well, maybe that's where the Hebrews got their 7-day week. Maybe it was because the number 7 was important in their culture. Maybe the number 7 was important because of the number of planets, or it could have been because of something else. 7 is a prime number. And prime numbers are often, regarded as special or significant because they don't behave like other numbers. And so that's a possibility too. Unfortunately, we really don't know how the Hebrew week developed, historically speaking. And as a result, this issue really wouldn't have an impact on the dating of the Pentateuch, because not knowing how the week arose in Israelite society, we couldn't use that information that we don't have to determine anything about the dating.
Rose, thank you very much for that question. It's Internet Open Forum. Jimmy Akin is our guest. Let's go to Mike's question. Mike asks this: I caught just a part of the show on one of the cable channels, and a so-called Middle East historian was laying blame heavily on the Romans versus the Pharisees for Jesus' death. He said that putting Jesus to death was not the Jewish way. He said that the Romans viewed Jesus as a threat to keeping order, and to them, he was just one of hundreds that they killed in a week. And he also said that there were at least 100 other Jews claiming to be the Messiah at the time. I never heard that before. Your thoughts on the accuracy of those statements?
I think they're considerably exaggerated. It is true that there were various other claimants in the 1st century AD who represented themselves as messianic figures, but it wasn't 100 of them in the ministry of Christ. That's clearly exaggerated. It's also not true that Romans put hundreds of people to death every week during the reign of Christ. Now, after the Jewish war broke out, when the Romans were besieging Jerusalem, they put to death thousands all at once. But that's during a war that happened decades later. They were not killing 100 people by crucifixion or other means every single week in Jerusalem. If they had done that, the Jews would have revolted, and the Jewish war would have happened a lot earlier. In terms of it not being the Jewish way to kill Jesus, well, that you got to look at what are they accusing him of? Well, before the Romans, they accuse him of being the Messiah and thus a political revolutionary, and that's because that's something the Romans would care about. The Romans did not want political revolutionaries. But in terms of what actually motivates the Jewish leaders, what they care about is blasphemy, and they did kill people for blasphemy. You can see an example. Not only is it commanded in the Old Testament, but you can even see an example of that in the New Testament, which we'll talk about on the other side of the break.
Mike, thanks for the question. It's Internet Open Forum. Jimmy Akin is our guest. Lots more questions from the internet coming up right after this on Catholic Answers Live. This year, the Catholic Answers Conference turns its attention to the question of God in an age of unbelief. Join us September 21st through 24th in San Diego for I Believe in God, featuring very special guest Scott Hahn and an all-star lineup of speakers. Spend 4 fun days with your favorite Catholic Answers apologists. Seats are still available, but going fast. Use promo code EARLY to save $50 and register today at CatholicAnswersConference.com.
Want to know more about the origins of the Catholic Church? Joe Heschmeyer explores the beginnings of Christianity. In the early church was the Catholic Church. Joe digs deep into the words and actions of those who lived right after the apostles to refute anti-Catholic claims of how the faith was lived back then. Order your copy of The Early Church Was the Catholic Church today at shop.catholic.com or get it at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
If you're not a Bible scholar, the full message of how the Sunday Mass readings fit together can be tough to comprehend. Apologist Carlo Broussard is here to help. Join Carlo every Friday for the Sunday Catholic Word podcast. In each episode, he unpacks the scripture readings for that Sunday and brings them all together so you can better understand and defend the faith. Visit SundayCatholicWord.com to subscribe. That's SundayCatholicWord.com.
What if the voice of your deepest doubts about Catholicism rose up in the form of a human being and challenged you to defend your most foundational beliefs? That's the task apologist Trent Horn took upon himself in his new book, Devil's Advocate, a dialogue with his own best objections against the faith that he professes and defends. You can stand up against your doubts, and Trent will show you how. Pick up your copy of Devil's Advocate today at shop.catholic.com or at a good Catholic bookstore near you. Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live on this Feast of the Assumption, celebrated each year on August 15th. And we've got an internet open forum for the Feast of the Assumption. Jimmy Akin here with us. And Mike asked a kind of long question, but about the treatment. Who killed Jesus, the Romans or the Jews? And were there lots of other messiahs? Were there lots of people being crucified at that time? And Jimmy, you were in the midst of an answer from Mike.
Yeah, so one of the things that Mike proposed, or that he mentions this person he heard interview proposing, is that it wouldn't have been the Jewish way to kill Jesus as the Messiah. And that's true. They wouldn't have killed him just because he claimed to be the Messiah. They were expecting a Messiah, and they were expecting the Messiah to bring military victory over the Romans. But they didn't think Jesus was the guy. In John 11, we have a discussion among the Jewish High Council where they're debating what to do about Jesus. And the high priest says, don't you guys realize it's better for one man to die than the whole nation to be destroyed? Because if we let Jesus go on like this, everyone's going to believe in him. He's going to start a revolution, and the Romans are going to come in and stomp us and destroy the temple. So it's not that they wanted to kill him because he was a Messiah. It's because they thought he's not the right guy for this mission. And so he's not actually the Messiah. He's going to bring disaster on us. So that was one of their motives. But it's not the one that finally triggered them to turn him over to the Romans. Now, we should mention why they turned him over to the Romans. It's because the Romans, apart from very limited circumstances, had deprived the Jewish authorities of capital punishment. So they couldn't sentence someone to death. The Romans could do that, but the Jewish authorities, under ordinary circumstances, could not. That was the job of the Roman governor, who at this time was Pontius Pilate. And so the Gospels record that the Jewish authorities going to Pilate and saying, we can't impose the death penalty, but this guy's claiming to be the Messiah, and you know what that's going to mean? He's going to start a political rebellion, and so under your own law, you ought to do away with him to prevent that rebellion from happening. Well, okay, so they didn't really care about the Messiah issue. What finally triggered them, I mean, they cared that they didn't think Jesus was the one. But what finally triggered them was blasphemy. And Jews did execute people for blasphemy. It's stoning, for example, is required in the Old Testament law. If someone blasphemes God, you're supposed to stone him to death. And having visited Israel, the first time I went to Israel, it became very clear to me why stoning was the national form of capital punishment, because it's very rocky and they got stones laying all over the place. So it's very convenient. But we do see, even in the New Testament, an example of execution by the Jewish authorities for blasphemy. Now, this is found in the book of Acts, and it's St. Stephen, the first Christian martyr. He gets up, he's giving a speech to the Sanhedrin, and he is recounting the history of God's dealings with the people of Israel, and he's recounting the story of Jesus, and then he has a vision and sees Jesus in heaven at the right hand of God, implying that he's on the same plane as God. So he's not just a human Messiah. He's right up there. He's God's right-hand man. He's on the same plane as God. And this ties in to what in modern scholarship is called the two powers in heaven doctrine, which was a view that is today it's considered heretical in Judaism, but it was not considered heretical at the time, at least not by all Jews, to regard there as being both Yahweh, the true God, and then there's also kind of a second Yahweh in heaven. And so there's like a second divine figure in heaven. And when the Sanhedrin hears Stephen saying that Jesus is that second power in heaven, they regard it as blasphemy and they stone him to death. You might say, how could they do that if the Romans took capital punishment away from them? Well, okay, number one, people often exceed the law if they're really impassioned by something. But secondly, we do know of cases where in gaps between Roman governors, the Jewish people would resume the power of capital punishment. And we know of that's how Jesus's brother, so-called brother, James the Just, got killed. It was in a gap between two Roman governors. And so what that suggests is that this incident with Stephen likely occurred in AD 36, when Pontius Pilate was recalled to Rome and there was no governor. And so that suggests that Stephen's execution occurs at the end, just after the end of Pontius Pilate's tenure as governor, before the Romans sent in a new governor. And there was a gap there because they first recalled Pilate, they let him give his defense, and then they deposed him and sent in a new guy. So that's probably when this happened, but it illustrates the point that the Jewish authorities would execute someone for blasphemy. So what happens in the Gospels at the trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin? Well, the Gospels, Mark, for example, reports that they had a bunch of witnesses who gave false testimony, and their testimony, the testimony of the witnesses didn't agree with each other, so they were contradicting each other about Jesus. And then the high priest, Caiaphas, finally asks Jesus, "Are you the Son of the Blessed One? Tell us yes or no." And what Jesus says, he acknowledges that he is, but then he says something very interesting. He says, from now on, you're going to see the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. And that's a reference to the book of Daniel, because in Daniel, Daniel has a vision of God and his heavenly council seated on thrones, and then a cloud comes rolling up, and there is a figure like a son of man, looks like a human being, seated on the cloud, and he is given everlasting dominion. And this is one of the texts, because this son of man, he's not coming from the earth. He's already in heaven. And he shows up and is given tremendous authority by God. And this was one of the passages that was used in the two powers in heaven doctrine. They would say, okay, that son of man on the cloud, that's the second power. That's the little Yahweh, or the second Yahweh. That's who that is. And so by Jesus saying in this context, tell us who you are, from now on, you're going to see the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He's saying, I'm that guy. I'm the second power in heaven. I'm the second Yahweh. That's who I am. And the high priest then tears his clothes because he recognizes what Jesus is saying. And he says, do we need any more testimony? You've all just heard the blasphemy. So they regard Jesus as having blasphemed God, and that's something they will execute people for. Only since Pontius Pilate is still here, they got to do it through him. So they go to Pilate and turn Jesus over and give Pilate an exaggerated story about Jesus's messianic claims, which is partly true but partly false, because Jesus doesn't believe his kingdom is of this world. So he's not going to start a political revolution. And actually, this all fits. Now, is it possible that the Romans may have had more malice towards Jesus than the Gospels report? Sure, because the Gospels don't report everything. But the idea that this just never happened is nonsense. It actually fits with what we know about this time and place.
Mike, I beg your pardon. Thank you very much for that question coming to us via the internet. I think I'm going to take the break now because I don't want to interrupt the next couple questions with the break. So let's take a very quick break, and we'll be right back with more Internet Open Forum with Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live.
Hello, this is Archbishop Salvatore Cordileone of San Francisco. Keep your dial tuned to Catholic Answers Live.
In Morse code, the sequence SOS is a distress call. It's been said that it stands for Save Our Souls. Well, right now our world is in big trouble, and we're putting out an SOS call for help. Will you answer that call? St. Paul Street Evangelization, a Catholic nonprofit, has hundreds of teams who share the good news with souls who don't know Jesus. Catholic Answers is supported in part by St. Paul Street Evangelization. Visit streetevangelization.com to get involved.
He is only one of 4 popes honored as the Great.
Matthew Bunsen and the Doctors of the Church.
St. Leo I was pope at a time when Roman civilization was being overrun by barbarian armies. He stood as a light in the darkness and even saved the city of Rome from destruction by Attila and the Huns. Leo died in 461.
For more about the Doctors of the Church, visit doctorsofthechurch.com.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Lots of stuff to sink your teeth into in these questions so far today. It's Internet Open Forum. All these questions come to us via the internet. You can participate if you ever want to just send us an email, radio@catholic.com. We'll get your internet question into the lineup. This one comes from Mark. He says, say we could travel back in time. What year would you like to travel to and why? Also, if we could travel to Jesus' time, would he know that we didn't belong? And what do you think he'll say or do?
Okay, so Mark specifically limited it to travel back in time. And if he hadn't included the word back, I would say I'd like to go to the year 2150 or something like that, because that's after I'm likely to be dead, but not so far after I'm dead that I couldn't get useful information to come back and make, for example, a lot of money with, or develop scientific techniques that could extend my life.
Yeah.
So
You could get the
Going-
sports almanac from.
Yeah, go into the near future would enable me to have useful information in the present. But if we're limited to going back in time, then the key things that I would be interested in likely would be research. And I don't have a specific year that I would like to go to, but I would like to go to situations where I could get significant questions answered. Like one possibility might be going to the year 1963 and going to the book depository and seeing, exactly what happened, and, filming what happened on the grassy knoll in 4D, and seeing, okay, was Lee Harvey Oswald behind the rifle in the sniper's nest, or was it someone else? And figuring out that mystery. I've often mentioned that one of the things I would like very much is a lost set of books. There are five books that together are known as the Exposition of the Logia of the Lord by a bishop named Papias of Hierapolis. And Papias wrote what looks like a commentary on the Gospels. It looks like that's sort of what his 5-volume set is. And of course, these are short volumes. This would be basically the length of the Gospels plus Acts. And I'd love to read that because he's relying on traditions that are extremely early. He wrote this, around the year 100, and it's based on research he did a little before 100. So it would be absolutely fascinating to have his book. And so I might go back to when he wrote it and get one of the original copies, or at least, take my iPhone and photograph one of the original copies, because it would be absolutely fascinating. If I were to travel to Jesus's time, and that's also something that would be high on my list of times I'd like to go to, whether he would know that we didn't belong would depend on a couple things. One of them would be, you'd say, well, what would clue him in to the fact that we don't belong? Well, maybe the fact we can't speak Jewish Palestinian first century Aramaic fluently, and with the right accent. So that might give it away. Also, if we're dressed like we're from the 20th century, or like we're wearing some kind of time travel suit, that could give it away. So he might learn through purely natural means that we don't belong. On the other hand, he might learn it through paranormal means. He might, the Gospels record Jesus knowing what's in men's hearts, so that's telepathy. And he might learn about who we are and where we're from telepathically, or he might learn it by direct download of information from his divine consciousness, which is omniscient and knows everything. And if that information is transferred to his human consciousness of who we are, then he would know that in his human consciousness as well. Now, there's a debate about how much information is transferred from Jesus's divine consciousness to his human consciousness. Everybody agrees that his human consciousness is not omniscient. It does not contain an infinite amount of information like his divine consciousness does, because human consciousnesses are finite. The human intellect is finite. But a common opinion historically has been that basically all the knowledge of the actual world was downloaded into Christ's human intellect. In his divine intellect, he knew about all the possible worlds that God could have made, but that knowledge is infinite, so he doesn't have that. Instead, he has all knowledge about the actual world. And if that theory is correct, then it would include knowledge of who we are and where we're from as time travelers. On the other hand, that position, even though it's been historically very influential, does not seem to be the one that the magisterium has recently been proposing. If you look in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, it acknowledges that there were things Jesus did not know, And it says that that's because he wasn't sent to reveal them. What he did have in his human intellect was all the information that was relevant to his mission. And so what he said he didn't know was information he was not tasked with revealing as part of his mission. And if this mission-centric understanding of Christ's human knowledge is correct, then he would only supernaturally know who we are as time travelers if it was relevant to his mission. But if dealing with time travelers was not really part of his mission, then he presumably, on this theory, would not have that information downloaded and would have to learn it some other way.
Mark, thank you very much for the time travel question. Appreciate it. Let's go to Alex's question. What happened to the 500 people whose tombs were opened right after Jesus died? Then they appeared in many places. Were they resurrected?
Okay, so we need to untangle a few things here. One of them is there's two different passages. There is a passage in 1 Corinthians 15 that refers to 500 people in connection with Jesus's resurrection. But these are not 500 people whose tombs were opened. These are 500 people who saw Jesus after the resurrection. So Paul is recounting all the different people who've seen Jesus, and he mentions Peter, and he mentions James, and he mentions himself, and he mentions the 12. And in that process, he also says, and once 500 people saw him at the same time, and some of them are still alive. So these were 500 living people who encountered Jesus. Maybe he gave a speech, kind of like the Sermon on the Mount or something, and you have a big crowd of people watching. So they're not the ones whose tombs were open. That's reported not in 1 Corinthians, but in Matthew. In Matthew's account of the crucifixion, he notes that when Jesus died, the tombs of various saints in the Jerusalem area were opened. And then it seems like they wait until the resurrection, and then they go into Jerusalem and appear to people and let people see them. So they didn't appear in many places. They just appeared in Jerusalem. And we don't know how many it was. I would assume it would have been a much smaller number than 500. Exactly how many I couldn't say, but that's who these people were. And in terms of were they resurrected? Well, yeah, just like Jesus was. They came back from the dead. What's not clear from the text is were they resurrected in a glorified state or a non-glorified state? Jesus was resurrected in a glorified state, but other people like Lazarus are resurrected in the Gospels in non-glorified states. So they will, for example, die again. It's possible these people could have had a glorious resurrection or a non-glorious one, but they were resurrected. What's also uncertain is what happened to them afterwards, because Matthew doesn't tell us, and we don't have any early sources that address these figures. One possibility is after they appeared to people, they went back to their tombs and deanimated. Another possibility is they continued to live for a while and then experienced normal death, the way Lazarus would have. Another possibility is maybe they ascended to heaven, either with Jesus or in some other way. And so it's a very mysterious text, and we don't really know a lot about it, but that's what I can tell you based on the biblical record.
Alex, thank you for that question.
And the exposition of the Logia of the Lord might have more information. I'm just saying.
if only. It's out there somewhere, probably.
Hopefully.
And one hopes. Let's go to a question from Mike. Now, this is a different Mike, I think, but I don't know. I said that, but I don't know. Mike asked this. Someone I work with claimed that artists painted Jesus and the saints with halos, not just to indicate their holiness, but because they likely had an aura around them in real life. I'm having a hard time buying that, but wondered if Jimmy could come up with any possible scientific explanation that could support that line of thought.
So I assume that they're not referring to a visible aura that you could see with your physical eyes, because that would mean they were glowing with visible light for some reason. And I'm not aware of anyone who claims that. What I am aware of is people in the paranormal community who claim to be able to see human auras. And these auras are regarded as not something you see, at least normally, with your physical eyes, but something you mentally perceive. And they're reported to be like an energy field that surrounds a person. And depending on the shape of the energy field, or especially its color, you can learn something about the person. So I might say, "Oh, Sai, your aura is very red today. What's going on?"
I'm so mad.
And yeah, maybe. And so people who believe in these auras sometimes look at religious art and they notice, oh, Jesus has a halo and the Virgin Mary has a halo and St. Paul has a halo. And so these are like auras. And so maybe that's what inspired this art. Well, I'm not at all confident of that because, and I'd have to do some more research into the history of art, but my impression is that, radiance is associated with holiness in the Bible. And these halos are normally understood as a sign of holiness. So, you notice the halos are always the same color. They're like white or golden. They're not red and blue and purple. So it seems to me that the color scheme that's used for them, white is associated with holiness in Western art. And so it is a sign of their holiness. And it may even be the case, my memory's fuzzy on this, that the circular shape of the halo is a modification of a crown, because crowns were circular in shape. And maybe they just kind of tilted that crown to become what we think of as a halo. You even see some depictions of halos where it's like a little crown floating above the person's head. So that may be the actual origin in Western art. I'd have to check that out. However, since Mike asked for a scientific explanation, I can mention that there has been scientific research done in parapsychology on auras. Because if people claim they see auras, well, let's check that out. Let's test that. Let's find out how that works, if it's true. So one of the things you can do, if an aura really is an energy field that surrounds a person, then it extends beyond the person. Let's say you got a 6 foot tall person and his aura extends 6 inches above the top of his head. Okay, let's take a 6 foot tall screen and either put the 6 foot tall person behind the screen or not, and ask an aura percipient when he's there. Because if
what a
there's
clever experiment.
Yeah, so if he's projecting a 6-inch aura off the top of his head, they should be able to spot him even if his physical head is covered up by the screen. And they could say, oh, he's there now, I can see his aura, versus, oh, he's not there now, I can't see his aura. Well, that's been done, and they didn't have any evidence of aura perception. So it looks like that's not the explanation. There's not an actual energy field that people are perceiving that extends beyond the human body. So what else might account for this? Well, there's another phenomenon known as synesthesia. Synesthesia is a cross connection between two different sensory modalities. And everybody has a little bit of synesthesia. That's why we talk about notes being sharp, even though notes are not literally sharp. Sharpness is a texture, not a sound. Or flat, which is another texture. Or it's why we say, ooh, that cheddar is really sharp. It has a sharp taste. Again, sharpness is a texture, not a taste. But there's more to say about that, and we'll say it at the beginning of the next hour.
All right, we're going to continue with Internet Open Forum, and Jimmy will continue with us the next hour. A whole bunch more questions from the Internet for Jimmy on this Feast of the Assumption. And we're going to take a very quick break. Check out all the deals over at shop.catholic.com while we're on that break. I know we got deals. I just don't have the paper in front of me to tell me what they are, so just check them out. And we'll take a very, very brief break and be right back to continue with this discussion of the aura and the halo and tackle a whole bunch more great internet questions with Jimmy Akin right after this on Catholic Answers Live. Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live on this Feast of the Assumption, August 15th. At least that's the date here in Southern California. You might have finished the Feast of the Assumption if you're on the other side of the date line, but whatever day it is, we're happy you're here with us. It's Internet Open Forum today, and Jimmy Akin is our guest, so if I give out the number, that'll be a mistake. Jimmy Akin, of course, senior apologist here at Catholic Answers, the author of A Daily Defense, 365 Days Plus One to Becoming a Better Apologist, and proprietor of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Jimmy, thank you for being here for another hour.
My pleasure, Cy Kellett, host of Catholic Answers Live.
But when we left, I'm going to just read Mike's question again so we can restart that, because you were in the midst of the answer when we went to the break. And he says that someone he works with claimed that artists painted Jesus and the saints with halos, not just to indicate their holiness, but because they likely had an aura around them in real life. I'm having a hard time buying that, but wondered if Jimmy could come up with a possible scientific explanation that could support that line of thought.
So, as I said at the end of last hour, I think that what the person is likely claiming is not that Jesus and the other saints were visibly glowing with visible light that you could see with your physical eyes, but instead that they had an aura that you could perceive mentally. Like there are various people who claim to see auras around other people and note the color of the aura and so forth. I don't think that's a particularly likely explanation for the artwork, for reasons I talked about then, and I won't go through all that again. But I will talk about aura perception and what's likely responsible for it. As I mentioned, there have been tests done by parapsychologists to see, is someone really able to see something like an energy field around a person. And one way of doing that is blocking them from seeing the person. Like if you got a 6 foot tall person, you put a 6 foot tall screen in front of the person. And then if there's a physical field around the person that extends beyond their body, they should be able to see the physical field, or the energy field poking out from above the top of the screen when the person is there, and then see that it's not there when the person is not there. And so there have been tests done where parapsychologists have set up such screens and said, okay, is there someone behind this screen or not? And the answer seems to be that aura percipients, that is, people who claim to perceive auras, are not seeing such a field. They can't tell the difference between when a person is or is not behind the screen. And so that suggests that there's not a literal energy field that they're picking up on around the human body. Now, we do emit energy. I mean, heat, for example, is a form of energy that we release, and so you can see a human on thermal vision, but and you can, if you look close, if it's really accurate thermal vision, you could even see a little heat halo around people, but that's not what they're picking up on. So what might they be picking up on? Well, there is a known psychological phenomenon known as synesthesia. The sthesia part of that means feeling, and the syn part means sun. It's from the Greek preposition sun. It means together. So synesthesia is a kind of together feeling where you cross connect two different sensory modalities, like texture and taste. So even though sharpness is a texture, a knife is sharp, you could say, oh, that cheddar, that has a really sharp taste, that's sharp cheddar. And everybody has some degree of this cross connection between different sensory modalities, which leads to a lot of the metaphors we use. Like, for example, warm colors, warm is a temperature, or cool colors, cool is a temperature, not a color. And so we've all got a little bit of this, but about 4% of the population has more intense synesthesia. And these people are known as synesthetes. I happen to be one of them. In fact, I have multiple types of synesthesia, so I'm what's sometimes called a polysynesthete. To give you an example, one of the kinds of synesthesia I have is a very common kind known as grapheme color synesthesia, where I connect written shapes like letters and numbers, those are graphemes, with colors. So for me, the letter A is red, the letter J is green, the number 3 is purple, the number 4 is seafoam green. And as soon as I see letters, I associate them with these colors, which I don't physically see, but I see them in my mind. So for example, Cy, your name, is yellow and blue for me. So when I hear Cy or see Cy written, I think yellow and blue. Well, that grapheme color synesthesia is just one type of it. There are multiple others. In fact, there's something like 150 types of it that have been identified. And one of the ones that's been getting discussion recently in the synesthesia community is an association between personality or mood and color. So if you can look at a letter and associate it with a color, or if you can look at a color and associate it with a temperature, why can't you, or a texture, or whatever it may be, why can't you associate a personality or a mood with a color? And so the proposal is that aura perception is really a form of synesthesia, where you have certain synesthetes who associate moods or personalities with colors. So you could, if I had this, and I don't have this type of synesthesia, but if I did, then I might look at you, Cy Kellett, and based on your way of behaving and the mood you're projecting and the kind of personal feel of your personality, I might say, oh, Cy, you have a blue aura. I'm just associating the color blue with you. And then if on another day you're really upset about something, I might say, oh, Cy, your aura is normally blue, but today it's got little brown spots all over it, or something like that. And so that seems to be the current best understanding of what's responsible for aura perception. Now, you'll notice, as I mentioned at the end of last hour, the halos that we see in art, they're either white or golden. Yeah. And they're associated with holiness. And holiness is a personal disposition. It's like a personality or a mood. And so that association between holiness and whiteness or goldenness, because white and gold, those are colors. Those are not dispositions. That itself looks like a kind of synesthesia, is responsible for that in the art. Yeah. And so somehow, possibly because of the universal synesthesia that all humans have, or possibly because of some individual artists who were synesthetes, it became a tradition in art to depict holiness using those two colors. And so it looks like we may have synesthesia both responsible for the artistic convention and for aura perception, even though the two are not directly connected.
Well, Mike, I hope that answer was satisfying to you. Thanks very much for the question. That brings us to the first break. We'll take a break and be right back with more Internet Open Forum with Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live.
Let us help you with your question today on Catholic Answers Live.
Do you have a question but prefer to ask it privately? Catholic Questions can help. Go to CatholicQuestions.com to ask your question online, email us, drop us a letter, or give us a call. Longtime Catholic Answers Live apologist and author Jim Blackburn or another Catholic Questions apologist will be happy to assist you. Catholic Questions proudly supports Catholic Answers Live, so visit us at CatholicQuestions.com today. That's CatholicQuestions.com.
The power of prayer simply means that words have an effect. For example, when a couple says, I do, it literally changes two people to becoming one in marriage. When you say, I love you, it changes us and it gives us value. The power of prayer is in the words and in the sentiment, but it's also in the fact that God, who is omnipotent, all-powerful, answers our prayers.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. I'm Cy Kellett, your host. Jimmy Akin is our guest, and it's an Internet Open Forum today. Lots of wonderful questions from the internet for Jimmy. Again, if that's something you'd like to participate in the future, just shoot us an email. radio@catholic.com is our email address, radio@catholic.com. And this one comes from Mark. How can we explain the simplicity and unchanging nature of God with the fact that God the Son took on a human nature in real time? This is something that has always stumped me.
So I think that I understand the stump factor because we are time-bound beings here, and time is all we've experienced, and it can make it hard to think about what's it like for a being that is not time-bound the way we are. And to help us think about this, it's useful to use metaphors. And so what I'll do here is propose a metaphor. If you imagine me with a stream in front of me, and I reach down my hand and poke my fingers into the stream, and then you freeze that image. So I've got my hand poking down into the stream. Well, because the image is frozen, I'm not changing. But if you look at my hand, I've got 5 fingers, and they're in a sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so even though I'm not changing because the image is frozen, I have my fingers in an environment that's different than my environment. They're underwater, and they're in a sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's a metaphor that can help us understand what it's like for God. God, becoming incarnate. God is in the eternal now. He doesn't change, but he enters into or unites himself to a human nature that's within time and that does have a sequence. So, there's an early moment in Jesus's life, and then he gets born, before he's even born. Then there's a later moment, when he appears in the temple when he's 12 years old, and he starts his ministry when he's about 30. Then he is crucified when he's about 34, and so forth. Now, God, in his eternal nature, is not changing. He exists outside of time in the eternal now, but he projects, if you want to think of it this way, this is the metaphor part, he projects, or more literally unites himself with a human nature that's inside of time. And that human nature, because it's subject to time, is something that is sequential and has sequential experience, kind of like the sequence of my fingers once I stick them down into a stream. And so, there are other ways of depicting the relationship between God's eternal now and the flow of time. Another one that I use is standing back and looking at a mural. If you're in a museum and you look at a mural that's painted on a wall, you can see the whole mural without turning your head. And murals often tell a story. Let's say it's a history of technology mural. So at the far left end of the mural, you've got the invention of fire, and then you've got the plow, and then you've got the wheel, and eventually at the right end, you've got the development of the rocket ship, and so forth. But you can see that entire progression of technology across time all at once if you're standing outside at a distance looking at the mural from the outside rather than being caught up in the flow of events within the mural. And that's kind of what it's like for God. He is in an eternal now where he doesn't change, but he can comprehend all of history all in the same moment from his perspective. And if you want to modify it a little bit, this metaphor a little bit more, you could say, well, what if the mural's still wet? What if God's finger painting it and he's like shoved his hands up on it and is manipulating it? Well, again, that's kind of like God uniting himself or entering into the flow of time while in his own essence, he is outside of time. Now, these metaphors are only partial. They do have limits, as all metaphors do, because no two things in a metaphor ever correspond to each other one-to-one. But I think that, at least for me, these are helpful metaphors in that they can help us think about how an unchanging being like God can nevertheless be aware of and even participate in change without himself changing. What he's doing is everything he does, and from his perspective is he's doing everything he does all at once. But from our perspective, we see God doing things one thing at a time, which is why Jesus can have a life that has different stages. From God's perspective, every stage of Jesus's life is happening at once. From our perspective, the stages of Jesus's life are happening one at a time.
Thanks very, very much, Mark, for that question. It's Internet Open Forum. This one comes from Deacon Brian. Deacon Brian asks, ask that you will do this, perhaps deal with the interesting paradox, and he has a question mark, of Judas receiving the morsel, communion, as he contemplated betraying Jesus.
Okay, so this is something that people wonder about. Did Judas receive communion, and how would that work? Isn't that incongruous with him betraying Jesus? The truth is, we don't really know what happened, because the Gospels are not bound to record everything in chronological order. It was common in the ancient world because they didn't have precise, nobody had a watch, and most people didn't have calendars that they toted around with them, and dates and times were just not as important. What was important is what happened, not precisely when it happened. And so as a result, a lot of times they didn't preserve like the exact order of events. They would remember what happened, but in writing about what happened, sometimes they would organize the events chronologically, but sometimes they'd organize them in other ways, like, for example, by topic. And so you'd group events that are on the same topic together, rather than the strict order in which they occurred that you would see if you had a videotape of the event. And if you look at the gospel accounts of the Last Supper, they record stuff in different orders. So we can't have confidence in any one reconstruction of the events of the Last Supper. And given that, we don't know if Judas left before or after communion. We know he did leave, but we don't know whether it was before or after communion. So we've got two basic options. Judas left before communion, in which case he didn't receive it. Or he left after communion, in which case he presumably received it. And what could we make of that? Well, there's a common rule of thumb. I don't know how common it is, but there's a very useful rule of thumb when interpreting Jesus's parables. And that is, for each figure in the parable, try to figure out a lesson based on that character. So like in the parable of the prodigal son, you've got essentially three characters: the father, the prodigal son, and the older brother. And there's something to learn from each of them. We can learn something about repentance from the prodigal son. We can learn something about accepting repentant sinners from the father. And we can learn something about how we shouldn't react to repentant sinners from the older brother. And I think the same thing would apply in a lot of narrative situations. So if Judas received communion, there are two relevant figures, Jesus and Judas. So what would this tell us about Judas if he received communion? Well, number one, it would be a warning to us that we can receive communion unworthily, because Judas was in the act of plotting to turn Jesus over to the authorities. He had already decided, he'd already received money from the Jewish leaders to betray Jesus. And so this is a warning about how we can deceive ourselves and receive communion unworthily when we're in a state of sin, and that's a bad thing. It's also possible that by this point Judas didn't even believe in Jesus. That may have been why he was willing to turn Jesus over to them, and that would give us a different lesson about how Judas's example shows how even people who lack faith may end up receiving communion, and they may not properly value it for what it is because they don't believe. What about Jesus? What can we learn from his interaction if Judas received communion? Well, it seems to me that this illustrates how, despite our sins, including our betrayals of Christ or our lack of faith in Christ at times, he chose to make himself vulnerable in the Eucharist. He chose to allow himself in his sacramental form in the Eucharist to be received by people who weren't where they should be spiritually. And so that tells us something about how, as bad as desecrating the Eucharist is, it's something that Jesus knew was going to happen. He certainly knew it would happen in the fullness of time, but this would illustrate it happening on the very first night at the very first Eucharist. So that helps us understand something about Jesus's attitude. He doesn't approve of people receiving the Eucharist unworthily, and they may face consequences, and St. Paul says that they will, but it's something that Jesus chooses to tolerate out of his love for mankind and his desire to make himself accessible to us in the form of the sacrament, even knowing that some people will receive the sacrament unworthily.
Thanks very much for the question. I appreciate that, Deacon. We appreciate that you listen and that you write. And on we go. We got Matthew asked this, and this is a longer one as well, but I'll read it to you, Jimmy. Hello, Jimmy. I was wondering what your take is with regards to the inter-Christian dispute between two Protestant scholars in particular about the genre of the Gospels and their use of literary devices or lack thereof. One scholar says that because the Gospels are considered ancient biographies, this means that the evangelists felt free to use literary conventions of their day to communicate the story of Christ, event displacement, transferal of info from one character to another, and etc. While another scholar advocates for the reportage model, genre for the Gospels.
Or you could just say reportage model.
And says that the contrary view makes the Gospels less reliable as a result. What is your opinion on this dispute, and can a Catholic adopt the former view and still be faithful to Vatican II's proclamation that the Gospel writers were faithful in communicating the story of Christ?
So the Catholic Church does teach that the Gospels are accurate in reporting the story of Christ, but we've got to say, well, what do we mean by accurate? Because there are different standards, there are different levels of approximation when you're recounting something. You know, if I said, Cy Kellett, what's pi, the number? What is pi? What's its decimal expression?
3 point something.
Well, that's okay. That's correct. Pi to 0 decimals is 3. If I were to take it and make it more precise, though, so you just approximated pi as 3.
Yeah.
And that's fine. That is a valid approximation of it. It's an approximation to 0 decimals. What if I wanted a 2 decimal approximation of pi? Well, it would be 3.14. What if I wanted more? Well, it would be 3.141596 and so forth. But I have to approximate because pi is an irrational number. And it's impossible to give a finite decimal expansion of the number pi. So whenever we talk about the number pi and we're giving a decimal instead of just writing the number pi, the Greek symbol of pi, then we have to approximate it. And we simply have different people will have different expectations of what's an appropriate approximation. And it'll vary by circumstance. If you're just, if you're, if you're just at home and you're baking a pie and your wife has a 10-inch pie dish, okay, well, it would be okay to say that the circumference of the pie, that's going to be 30 inches. And to get it 30 inches, well, I just approximated pi as 3. And I don't really need it to be any more precise than that. But if I'm taking a geometry test, I'm probably going to need, or taking a class in engineering, or trying to design a bridge, I'm probably going to need to approximate pi more accurately than that, to a greater decimal expansion. And so what we see from that is different levels of approximation are fine. The question is what's considered appropriate approximation level for a given circumstance. So how does that fit with the Gospels? Well, what the Catholic Church understands is that the Gospels are human documents. They're written under divine inspiration, but they're written according to the literary conventions that were in use at the time. And so they would have the level of approximation. They accurately convey the story of Christ, but with the level of approximation that other ancient documents used. Now, then there's a discussion about what genre are they, and we'll talk about that on the other side of the break.
All right, let's take a quick break. It's Internet Open Forum. Jimmy Akin is our guest, and we will be right back with more Internet Open Forum right after this. This year, the Catholic Answers Conference turns its attention to the question of God in an age of unbelief. Join us September 21st through 24th in San Diego for I Believe in God, featuring very special guest Scott Hahn and an all-star lineup of speakers. Spend 4 fun days with your favorite Catholic Answers apologists. Seats are still available, but going fast. Use promo code EARLY to save $50 and register today at CatholicAnswersConference.com.
Our Lord needs articulate defenders of the truth to spread the joy of the Catholic faith. Catholic Answers monthly giving club, Society 315, helps you fulfill the call in 1 Peter 3:15 to always be prepared to make a defense for the hope that is in you. For as little as $10 a month, you'll help Catholics grow in faith, bring lapsed Catholics home, and lead non-Catholics to the truth. Go to casociety315.com and join today.
Want to know more about the origins of the Catholic Church? Joe Heschmeyer explores the beginnings of Christianity. In the early church was the Catholic Church. Joe digs deep into the words and actions of those who lived right after the apostles to refute anti-Catholic claims of how the faith was lived back then. Order your copy of The Early Church Was the Catholic Church today at shop.catholic.com or get it at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
If you're not a Bible scholar, the full message of how the Sunday Mass readings fit together can be tough to comprehend. Apologist Carlo Broussard is here to help. Join Carlo every Friday for the Sunday Catholic Word podcast. In each episode, he unpacks the scripture readings for that Sunday and brings them all together so you can better understand and defend the faith. Visit SundayCatholicWord.com to subscribe. That's SundayCatholicWord.com.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin, our guest. It's Internet Open Forum, and Matthew with a wonderful question about what kind of literature are the Gospels? Are they reporting, or are they an ancient biography form? And what does that mean about how accurate they are, Jimmy?
So the Church's understanding is that they do convey the story of Christ accurately, but they convey it in a way that was natural for documents of the time. And so they use the literary conventions of the time, and they use the level of approximation that was common at the time. And we can show that they aren't strict, they aren't just transcripts of what happened that present everything in exact detail, in exact chronological sequence, because we got 4 of them. And if you compare the incidents that are found in more than one gospel to each other, you will notice that there are differences. They don't affect the substance of the stories. The gist of the stories is the same, but there are differences that indicate this cannot simply be a transcript. For example, one of the things I mentioned in a previous question is that they're not bound to record things in strict chronological sequence. Sometimes they use topical sequence, and you can see that if you compare Mark's and Matthew's account of the cursing of the fig tree. In Mark, Jesus sees the fig tree and curses it, and then he goes to the temple And then they come back and they see that the tree is withered. But in Matthew, Jesus sees the fig tree, curses the fig tree, they see it withered, and then they go to the temple. So Matthew, being a later gospel than Mark, according to the evidence, has united the cursing and the withering of the fig tree because they're on the same topic. They're both about the fig tree. And so he's using a topical ordering rather than a chronological ordering at that part. Similarly, you have, and Matthew refers to this as transferal of information from one character to another. I'll give an example of this, but I commonly refer to it as telescoping, because you can have, how they have those collapsible telescopes where you can shove them down to one segment or pull them out to expand them. Well, if you look at Matthew's version of the healing of the centurion's servant, the centurion comes to Jesus and says, "Please heal my servant." And Jesus says, "Sure, I'll come to your house." And the centurion says, "Don't bother. I know you have the authority and I'm not worthy that you come." And Jesus is impressed and heals his servant. Okay, but then if you look in Luke's version, you find out the story is a little more complicated than that. Instead, what happens is the centurion doesn't come to Jesus. He sends Jewish synagogue elders to Jesus to ask on his behalf. And Jesus talks to the synagogue elders, and the same basic stuff happens, but the conversation is not face to face. It's carried on through the intermediaries or mediators of the Jewish synagogue rulers. Now, omitting unimportant people in a story is very common. We do it today. Like if you say Solomon built the temple.
Yeah.
Okay, Solomon did not pick up a hammer and a chisel and build the temple, certainly not all by himself. But we say Solomon built the temple because Solomon was in charge of it, even though he used agents, workmen, to do the building. But we omit the workmen because they're not the important ones for our purposes. Solomon is the one who gets the overall credit because he oversaw the project and paid for it. And in the same way, Matthew, looking at Luke's account, said, okay, these Jewish intermediaries, they're just agents of the centurion. Jesus and the centurion are having a conversation, but I don't need to mention these go-betweens. I can just drop them. And so we can see this happening in the Gospels. So we see, paraphrasing happening where it's Jesus is saying is phrased one way in Luke, but a little bit different in Matthew. We can see telescoping happening where the agents of the centurion have been telescoped into the person of the centurion. We see chronological rearrangements into topical arrangements. So we can tell this stuff's going on. It doesn't mean it's inaccurate. It's just we have to understand what level of approximation we can expect from the Gospels. And they're not strict transcripts, but they are true. And it is similar. Now, I mentioned genre, what kind of literature are the Gospels. And there has been discussion of this among biblical scholars. You used to have a position a number of decades ago among many skeptical scholars and liberal scholars that said the Gospels are just faith documents. They're composed of little units that circulated independently and eventually, much later, all got stitched together. And then it was pointed out, actually, no, they're a lot like other Greek biographies. The Greek word for a biography is a bios, which is a word that means life. So if you have the biography of Jesus, well, it's the life of Jesus. And bioi, that's the plural of bios, or one of them, bioi are well understood. We have other ancient bioi that we can read and learn about. One of the most famous set is Plutarch's Parallel Lives. Plutarch was a historian who was Greek, but he wrote a set of biographies where he would parallel figures from Greek history with comparable figures from Roman history. That's why they're called the parallel lives. So he'll say, oh, Julius Caesar, he's a Roman who's kind of like Alexander the Great, who was a Greek. And then he would put those two lives in parallel to each other. And one of the things you note when you read Plutarch's Lives is they're different from each other. For example, if he's talking about a figure that lived hundreds of years ago, there's going to be much less chronological detail than if he's talking about someone living in his own generation. And so for someone living a long time ago, he may have a birth narrative and a death narrative, and the stuff in the middle is just, here's a bunch of stuff this guy did. It's not, here's a bunch of stuff this guy did in this exact order. But if you're looking at someone from Plutarch's own generation, he has much more detail. And so into which category do the Gospels go? Well, there's a difference of opinion among dates, but basically all scholars date the Gospels to the 1st century. And I personally, based on my study, would date them to the 50s and 60s. So these are quite, whichever dates you prefer, these are quite recent. And so we would expect the Gospels to have the kind of detail and accuracy that you would expect in a recently written biography. So I think it is possible for a Catholic to adopt the understanding that the Gospels are bioi, at least broadly. They're not identical to other bioi, but they go in that general category, and that we have to read them in light of how documents in this period worked. And we can even show by comparing them that they have things like paraphrase and telescoping and rearrangement going on. And there's nothing unfaithful about that. The Catholic Church permits that, and Vatican II is consistent with that. In fact, that would be the position I've just described is more conservative than a lot of Catholic biblical scholars.
Matthew, thanks very, very much for the question. That brings us to the break. We'll take a quick break and be right back with more Internet Open Forum with Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live.
Hang on. Catholic Answers Live will return in a moment.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects homebuyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
One of the biggest mistakes a Christian can make is to try to do good without God's help. St. Therese said, when we trust only ourselves and not God, our soul becomes incapable of virtue. Her remedy? Works of charity. And the greatest work of charity is to share the gospel. At St. Paul Street Evangelization, a Catholic nonprofit, we encourage you to share the gospel with someone who doesn't know Jesus. Catholic Answers is supported in part by St. Paul Street Evangelization, streetevangelization.com.
The wisdom of Mother Angelica.
Isn't it awesome that we today do not recognize His presence in the Eucharist? Is it because we really don't go to Him in humbleness of heart and say, Lord, I don't believe, help my unbelief. Lord, I want to see you. I want to recognize you. I cannot live without you. Are we saying that?
EWTN. Live truth. Live Catholic.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live, Internet Open Forum. I love Internet Open Forum. It just gives people a chance to kind of, put it in writing, so we get the question clearly, and then we get an opportunity to get all kinds of questions we don't usually get. And this next one comes from Steve. And Jimmy, he asks this: is not receiving communion a form of scandal to the congregation? And then he follows it up with this question: is judging someone who gets a blessing the sin of assuming someone committed a mortal sin?
Okay, so question one, is not receiving communion a form of scandal to the congregation? Well, I can't say that there are so what scandal is not outrage. What scandal is, in the theological sense, is leading someone into sin. Well, can I imagine any scenarios where if I don't receive communion, I'm going to lead someone into sin? if I thought hard enough about it, I probably could come up with some bizarro scenario where the fact I don't receive communion causes someone else to sin. However, it seems to me the reverse is much more likely to be the case, where going to communion when one is not in a state of grace, or, or at least hasn't confessed, that could lead people to be uncritical of their own spiritual state and think they just should go whenever. And that could lead them into objective sin if they're not actually in a state of grace, or if they haven't been to confession and confessed all of the mortal sins that they have needed to confess, even if they've returned to a state of grace. They're objectively doing something they shouldn't. And so I can see how receiving communion can be a form of scandal, in that it leads people to sin if you are not qualified to receive communion at the moment. So I think that would be the much more likely circumstance. So it's important for people, if you need to go to confession and you haven't gone to confession, it's important to refrain. And that also sets a good example for others. You can also do compromise things like go up and receive a blessing instead of communion. Now, what about the second question? Is judging someone who gets a blessing the sin of assuming someone committed a mortal sin? Well, not if you don't assume that. Again, this is going to be, dependent on the situation. Now, I also should point out the technical sin here would not be assuming they have committed a mortal sin, because they may have committed a mortal sin and you just assumed that, and you may be right. So it's not a sin if you're right, or if you had adequate reason to think that. The technical name of the sin here is rash judgment. It does assuming that someone must have committed a mortal sin involve rash judgment? Well, it certainly can, because there are other reasons not to receive communion. For example, the person ate too recently and they're observing the Eucharistic fast. So, maybe they haven't sinned mortally at all. They just aren't fasting at the moment, or haven't fasted long enough to be able to receive communion. Or maybe they haven't committed mortal sin, but they have terrible scrupulosity and they're afraid they've committed mortal sin even though they haven't. Or maybe their spirituality is just different, because it used to be, today frequent communion is encouraged, but if you go back, a few hundred years, you know how often it was normal to receive communion? Once a year. Mm-hmm. So that was a valid form of Catholic spirituality. And it pertained in a lot of places for a long time. So maybe this person's Eucharistic spirituality is just different than yours. So and those are some examples of what could, and there are others, but those are some examples of what could lead a person not to receive communion. And we shouldn't assume they've committed a mortal sin, because there are a bunch of different options, and it would be rash judgment not to suspect that they might have committed a mortal sin, but to conclude that they must have committed a mortal sin when there are all of these other options. That would be rash judgment.
Steve, thank you very, very much.
So don't do it.
Yeah, right. Rash judgment. Don't do that.
Yeah, it's none of your business. If they're refraining, actually presume they have a good reason, whatever it may be, and it's not your business what that reason is. But they would actually be doing a good thing by refraining if they've got a good reason.
Again, thank you, Steve, very, very much. This one comes from, I don't know, No or Noe. Is it like Chloe?
Noah.
No. Oh, Noah. Oh, I'm sorry. I totally messed that one up. Is the canon of the Bible open? Could the church over time include more inspired books from the first century as canonical? I heard somebody once say that the language of Trent regarding the canon was not saying these are the only inspired books.
So the basic answer to the question is yes, the canon is open, in the sense that if you study the language that Trent uses when it infallibly defines the canon, it does not close it. it says the following books are sacred and canonical, and then it lists them. It does not say only the following books are sacred and canonical and all others are non-canonical or non-sacred. It just doesn't say that. Now, this is something you will often hear various people, including various apologists, say, oh, the canon is closed, nothing could ever be added to it. But that's not what Trent said. What they're giving you is their opinion, and it's not an opinion that's actually grounded in the text, because the text does not say that. And one of the things you learn quickly when you start studying magisterial documents is you cannot read your preferred opinions into the text. You may have it as your preferred opinion that nothing could ever be added, but you can't read that into the text just because you want it to be true. That's known as eisegesis, or reading into the text rather than reading out of the text. So I, a number of years ago, did a careful study of this, and Trent just does not use the language needed to say there are no other books that could be inspired or sacred or canonical. It just doesn't say that. Now, do I think it's at all likely that anytime in the near future the church is going to add something? No. But I can't imagine, and I've talked about scenarios where I could imagine in centuries that happening. Like if we have a reconciliation with the Eastern Orthodox. Well, a lot of the Eastern Orthodox have a few extra books that date from the 1st century that they do consider canonical. And for a time after reunion, or at the time of reunion, the church might say, we don't need to settle this question. The issue of these books didn't divide us in the early church, so we can leave it open now, where Catholics aren't required to recognize those books as canonical, but former Orthodox who are now back in union with us, they can recognize them as canonical. And they could let the two traditions exist side by side in the church, just like they did in the early centuries. And then let 500 or 1,000 years go by, and the Holy Spirit could guide the church's awareness to say, hey, maybe we should recognize those books as canonical. But I don't know that this will ever happen. It may well never happen. But it's a scenario I can imagine, because Trent just does not use the language to say there are no others, and I can't read my own preferences into the text. Now, I've heard other apologists sometimes say they don't care, or they seem to not care. They want to say Trent closed it in this extra way. But you know who agrees with me on the fact that that Trent did not pronounce negatively on every book that's not in the Catholic canon? The Pontifical Biblical Commission, under the direction of Cardinal Joseph Muller. They released a document a few years ago. It was approved for release by Pope Francis, but it was written under the direction of Cardinal Gerhard Muller, who is renowned for his orthodoxy.
He is indeed,
Yeah. And in this document, the Pontifical Biblical Commission pointed out that even though the church has said everything in its canon is canonical, it has not negatively pronounced on everything else, and said it can't be inspired or it can't be canonical. The document, if you want to get it, is called Inspiration and Truth of Sacred Scripture. It came out around 2013, 2014. So I understand people's desire to have a particular answer on this question in the negative, because there is a kind of intellectual comfort or safety in thinking this is it and this is all it ever could be. But that's just not what Trent said. And the Pontifical Biblical Commission under Cardinal Muller agrees with me.
And when we're talking about Trent, it's the Council of Trent, by the way. It's not Trent Horn, in case anybody was...
And it's not the podcast, the Council of Trent.
It's neither of those. Logan wants to ask this, and I do want to get this question in. Logan said, imagine you were in a bind, and you found someone on the brink of death who asked to be baptized. All you have is Gatorade or coffee or an energy drink with you. Can you baptize them, since water is contained in these products, or does it have to be a certain purity?
So here's what Canon 849 of the Code of Canon Law says. Baptism, the gateway to the sacraments and necessary for salvation by actual reception or at least by desire, is validly conferred only by a washing of true water with the proper form of words. So, according to the church in the Code of Canon Law, if it's going to be valid, you're going to need to use true water, which raises the question of what counts as true water. Well, there are a bunch of dimensions to this that I won't go into, but what I can say is there has been discussion among sacramental theologians. So since this is theology, we're now into the realm of opinion rather than church teaching. There has been discussion of what would count as true water, because not all water is pure. If you go down to the local mud hole that the elephants have been drinking from, well, it's water, but it's muddy water. It's got a considerable admixture of dirt particles in it. But nevertheless, most people would say muddy water is valid water. It doesn't have to be pure.
Right.
And so if you then say, okay, I've got Gatorade. It's mostly water. It's got some impurities, but is it actually more impure than the elephant mud water? Maybe not. You could do a particulate analysis and come up with how many parts per million are actually something other than H2O. But it's arguable that Gatorade is going to be just as much water as the elephant mud water. So consequently, what I've seen in sacramental theologians, like, for example, Nicholas Halligan in his book, The Sacraments and Their Celebration, is the idea that things that we don't consider water but are mostly water would be doubtful matter. If it's hard to tell, it would be doubtful, and you should never use doubtful matter unless you have to. So if you've got clearly pure natural water, that's what you use. You don't use something else. But what if we're in this emergency situation and all we've got is doubtful matter? Well, because of the emergency, this person is about to die and they want to be baptized, and baptism is the ordinary way of salvation. It's necessary, or at least its desire is. I would say this is extremely important that this person get baptized. What I would do is a conditional baptism. If I've got doubtful matter, I would baptize the person using the formula, if this is valid matter, I baptize you in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. And that way, if it's not valid matter, I'm not desecrating anything, because I only said I'm baptizing if it's valid matter. But if it's valid matter, then I'm actually baptizing the person, and that's a great spiritual good for him. So that's what I would do in this kind of situation.
And I'd stay away from the mud holes in Arkansas. Apparently they got elephants out there, so be careful. This one, Damon says, what about spit? It's mostly water, and Jesus used spit to heal some people.
He used spit to heal people physically. He didn't baptize them with spit. Spit is a bit different, because even though it is mostly water, it also has other stuff in it, like enzymes that help break down our food when we put it in our mouths. But spit is typically a category that is recognized by humans as different than water. Like, if you look on, I've been looking lately because I'm going to get dogs. I've been looking on dog breed pages, and one of the things they have for the breeds is how much does it drool. Well, we wouldn't care so much if spit were the same thing as water. If those belonged in the same category, you wouldn't have people really being concerned about how much does this dog breed drool. We recognize drool or spit as being in a different category than water, and that's at least, even though it's mostly water, that's at least a prima facie argument based on human categories that it would not be valid. But again, I would put it in the doubtful category, because I don't have an infallible ruling from the church on this. And if it's all I had, I could, in an emergency, I could see doing it conditionally.
Logan and Damon, thank you both for the questions. Thanks for everybody who submitted questions. Lots and lots of great ones. And we've got more. We keep a list. So if you want to get on that list and get your question answered on an internet open forum, maybe it's difficult for you to call where you are, or maybe you just want to write it out and let Jimmy answer it that way. You can send it to radio@catholic.com. Jimmy Akin, thank you very much for doing 2 hours of this with us today. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, Cy Kellett.
And that does it for us. We'll see you tomorrow, God willing, right here. Catholic Answers Live.